Assalamu class, welcome to online software requirement engineering lectures. This is week number 5 and we will discuss chapter number 7, requirement validation and negotiation. I'm your teacher Hassan Shah. Before we start the lecture, let's first introduce the objective of the lecture. So the objective of the lectures are to understand why it's essential to validate requirements, to identify and understand the 3 quality aspects of the requirements, to learn 6 principles of the requirement validation and how to apply them, and finally to understand different validation techniques. Let's move on to the lecture. Why validation? Validation and negotiation during requirement engineering is meant to ensure the document requirement meet the predefined quality criteria, which is basically correctness and the agreement between the stakeholders whether they are correct or not. Principles and techniques will be discussed later, which are used to validate and negotiate requirements as an individual or as an entire document. So before we jump into the techniques and principles of validation and negotiation, let's first understand the fundamentals of requirement validation and negotiation. So for validation, during the requirement engineering activity, it is necessary to review the quality of the requirements before they are developed. The requirements after gathering and documentation are presented to the stakeholders with these goals. Number 1, to identify deviations between the requirement defined by them, or to correct and develop as per their actual wishes and needs. The fundamental of requirement validations. The activity of requirement engineering demands approving the requirements to check whether they are of some level of quality. To further develop, if we need to develop them, we need to understand the quality, and then we can design them, implement them, and test them. Approving also means upholds predefined acceptance criteria. Goal of validation is to discover errors, ambiguity because of natural language, any incompleteness in the requirements, and any contradictions that can cause conflicts. Error proliferation. Errors negatively affect the further development activities. If they are not dealt properly, it will entail significant cost and time. Legal risks are the breach of contract between the client and the contractor based on the agreements, or critical errors in requirements can lead to the fact that contractual agreement cannot be met, which are expected quality or completion deadlines. Now look at the second part, which is requirement negotiation. The fundamentals of requirement negotiations demand that the contradictory requirements may cause conflicts. So permissions need to be granted by the stakeholder if we are eliciting the requirements and then validating them. If they are incorrect, documentation of the requirements, conflict between requirements and between stakeholders may arise. Risk and opportunities or conflicts. If one group stated requirements are to be implemented, it means that we are ignoring the second group, and this ignorance may cause problems or risk for the requirement engineer, that he may face resistance in development of the project because the other group may be possible that he is more competent than the first one or a major stakeholder of providing the requirements. So the opportunities are there, and the opportunity states that a new solution should be provided by the requirement engineer, which is an opportunity for him as well to give his input and develop a new idea free of conflicts. Goal of requirement negotiation. The goal is to understand agreed upon requirements of the system that need to be developed, reducing cost and risk in late phases. If we are negotiating, then of course it will reduce the cost and risk. Like both phases, validation and negotiation performed during entire project, it requires additional efforts and cost, and the advantage gained is significant. And the advantage is reduction of overall cost, increase in acceptance, supporting creativity and innovation. Let's move on and check about the quality aspect of the requirements. So the aim of the quality aspect of the requirement is to check requirements validation systematically. This will ensure an objective and consistent validation. We need quality criteria concretized and refined. To fulfill the overall goals of requirement validation is carried out using following goals. Number 1, to check the content. Number 2, to check the documentation. Number 3, to check the agreement. Content, whatever we have elicited and documented, it has to be of appropriate level of detail. When we talk about documentation, documented with respect to the predetermined guidelines for document and specification. Agreement with the documented requirements has to be there and all the stakeholders need to agree with it, free of conflicts. Let's move on. Let's check about the three aspects of the validation. The three quality aspects are the content, document, and agreement. Once the above aspects are checked, we can then approve the requirements for further development. Errors in the requirements will negatively influence development as the information will be erroneous and not agreed by the stakeholders. So the first quality aspect is content. It refers to the validation of requirements with respect to errors in the content. Erroneous information in content will affect the development activities. Therefore, content need to be tested first. So how we'll test it? Let's check out the testing criteria. If the quality aspect is neglected, then the requirement document is considered as violating a quality aspect. And if these things are fulfilled, then there won't be any content error. To make the content successful, the following error types need consideration are applied to the document. Number 1 is completeness of the entire document and the project. Second is the completeness of the individual requirement, and third is the traceability. And there furthermore we'll discuss later. Completeness of the requirements for the system to be developed need documented, like for the next releases. If we talk about individual requirements, the completeness means contain all necessary information which is required by the requirements. Traceability, have all relevant traceable relations been defined, for example to relevant requirement sources. There are furthermore test criteria, which is correctness and adequacy. Do the requirements accurately reflect the wishes and needs of the stakeholders? Consistency, is it possible to implement all defined requirements for the system to be developed jointly with no contradictions? No premature design decisions? Are there any expected design decisions present in the requirements not included by constraints? For example, constraints that specify a specific client-server architecture to be used. Have we defined that client-server architecture or not? Verifiability, is it possible to define acceptance and test criteria based on the requirements? And lastly, necessity, does every requirement contribute to the fulfillment of the goal? Let's move forward and talk about the quality aspect of documentation. It deals with the checking requirements with respect to flaws in the document or violations of the documentation guidelines, consideration of organizational guidelines, project specific guidelines, the structure of the requirement documents. Let's now move on and talk about the implications of document guidelines. If we will not fulfill these guidelines, there will be a risk involved in the documentation correctness. So the first thing is impairment of development activities. It may be possible to carry out development activities that are based upon a specific documentation format. Misunderstandings in a document. Requirements may not be understandable or may be misunderstood by the people that need to be comprehend them. As a result, the requirement may be unusable. Incompleteness, relevant information is not documented in the requirements. Overlooking requirements, if requirements are not documented at the position that they're supposed to be in the requirement document, these requirements may be overlooked in subsequent activities. Let's move on and let's find the testing criteria for documentation. To make the document successful, the following error types need considering and they are applied to the document. Number 1 is conformity to documentation format and to structure. This is to do with the, like for instance, has the specific requirement template or specific modeling language being used to document the requirements? Has the structure of the requirement document been maintained? For instance, have all requirements been documented at the position defined by the document structure? Next, understandability. understood in the context given. For instance, have all terms that are used been defined in the glossary? Unambiguity allows for only one interpretation. This has to do with the national language. For instance, does a text-based requirement not possesses any kind of ambiguity? You can understand it clearly. Conformity to document rules. Documentation guidelines are met. For instance, has the syntax of model languages being used properly? Let's talk about the third quality aspect, which is agreement. Checking requirements for flaws in the agreement of requirements between stakeholders. This is the last opportunity for change. You can't change afterwards. During the course of requirement engineering, stakeholders gain novel knowledge about the system to be developed, and they can always come up with that we need to change the requirements. And these requirements may lead to change in requirement documentation. So writing this thing down as change in requirements. Therefore, during requirement validation, give stakeholders the opportunity to request changes which will not affect development activities. Let's check out how we can test the criteria for the agreement. The quality aspect agreement is successful when requirements validation has been applied to the following error types. Three test criteria for the quality aspect agreements are: number one, agreed. Is every requirement agreed upon with all relevant stakeholders? Agreed after changes. Is every requirement agreed upon with all the relevant stakeholders after it has been changed? Third and last, conflicts resolved. Have all known conflicts with regard to the requirements been resolved? Let's move on and check out the principles for validation. So to validate the requirements, these are the 6 principles. These principles actually increase the quality of the validation results. So let's move on and check the first principle, which is involvement of the correct stakeholders. So choosing the stakeholders for requirements validation depends upon the goal of the validation and the requirement that are to be audited. So why would you choose the stakeholders? What group of stakeholder? These are based on the goal and the what need to be audited. Auditing stakeholders must have following aspects. They should work independently. Authors of the requirement should not be a part of any team. He will negatively influence the errors if they are part of the team. An error may be overlooked. So what we do is, it is possible to have internal and external auditors. There are perks for internal with respect to the external. Outdoor auditors should be welcome to audit preliminary requirements. External need payments and need to know the context of the project. So more time is required and cost is there as well. External auditors are only called only for requirements that are of high quality. Preferred are internal because they're easy to be found and coordinated. So principle number 2 is separation and identification of the errors. This is the basic principle and it is also a part of quality assurance, but it can be applied on requirement validation as well. Flaws are documented and double checked to determine the error identified. Concentrating on error identification. Separation helps auditors to concentrate on errors. Measures are taken for corrections. Advantage is that identified errors does not create additional errors. Premature errors without proof are not corrected because maybe they are identified as an error but actually they are not an error or just simply a confusion which is not identified or examined yet. So next principle is validation from different views. So validation from different views means prospective based validation. Another principle that has proven itself in practice and very useful, where requirements are validated and agreed upon from different prospects. It is a comparable method. For instance, in a legal trial, circumstances are often reported from the prospect of different people so that the sound overall picture can be gained. So if you're called in a legal trial, if you go to the court, you can present them with the comparable methods, which is actually a prospect of different people to understand the quality. If there are any problems in the quality or deployment of functions or the deadline of the project, you can argue there and you can win the case. So let's move on to the fourth principle. It is about adequate change of documentation type. Strength and weakness of documentation types are noted here. This principle is very important just because the strength of one document type is used to cover the other documentation type. For instance, natural language is to be combined with the graphical model to predict complex expressions. Simpler identification of errors, it's called transcribing, means showing a requirement in another form to simplify and helps in finding errors, which is like natural language is being displayed with model-based requirements. Let's move on to the fifth principle, which is construction of development artifacts. So if you have any artifacts that you have developed for the project, which can be a software or can be a prototype, suitability of the requirements of for design, test, and manual creation. During the course of validation, development of artifacts are carried out that help to validate the quality of requirements, like test cases to identify the errors in the requirements, require a lot of resource and execute in parts. Let's move on to the sixth principle, which is repeated validation. We validate requirements because during development, stakeholders may gain knowledge over time and ask for changes. So even if they are validated earlier in time, does not mean that they are finalized. There still may be changes possible in later stages. So validation of requirement has to be done multiple times during projects, especially in the following cases, where a lot of innovation ideas and technology used in the system, where there is a significant gain of knowledge during requirement engineering, where there is a long-lasting projects, when very early requirements validation is done, if the domain is unknown, and requirements that are to be reused, like if you have probably got the requirements from the previous projects and you want to reuse them, so you validate them first before you implement them. Let's move on and check out the validation techniques. They are very important. So there are a total of 6 validation techniques for the requirements, and these techniques are basically divided into two parts, that is the review and the prospect based. Before we move on to the techniques, there are certain things that need to be considered. Number one is identifying and inviting the right stakeholders, organizing suitable rooms, and providing supplies for the resources. These resources can be a paper, pencil, a printout, probably a prototype as well, and some documentation for on the prototype as well. So let's talk about the validation technique, which is number one, which is called review. So validation techniques, which are also known by the general term review, are used for requirement validation. The three major type of reviews are commenting, inspection, and walkthroughs. So we comment on the requirements, we inspect the requirements, and there's a third part which is walkthrough. So first one is commenting on the requirements, which is actually considered as individual validation of requirements. Here, the author of the requirement hands over his document to another person, which is a co-worker, and he reads the requirements prior coming to a venue before he comes and see the team. The goal is to receive expert opinion on the quality of requirements. The co-worker reviews the requirement with the goal to identify issues that impair the requirement quality, which may be ambiguity or errors, anything, with respect to predefined quality criteria. The identified flaws are marked in the requirement document and briefly explained. Let's move on to the second technique, which is called inspection. This technique is also known as technical review. Individual separation of errors are obligatory part in inspection. Typical phases are planning, overview, defect detection, defect correction, follow-up, and reflection. But for review technique for validation, we only use relevant phases for requirement validation, for separation, identifying, and correction, and these are planning, overview, error detection, and error correction. A strict process is implemented for systematically inspection of the software artifact. So if we have any prototype, we need to be very strict to get the answers and review to validate it of the auditors. So let's check out the typical phases. of inspection. So we have planning, we have overview. The individuals are preparing. Inspection meetings are called at the venue. They take some decisions and revision or rework is given to the author again. So let's talk about the phases of inspection. The first phase is called overview. In this phase, the author explains the requirements to all team members for common understanding among all inspectors. Error detection is the second part. The inspectors search through the requirements for errors. The inspector search through the requirements of errors, performed individually by each inspector or collaboratively in a team. Advantages that we can get are individual inspection advantage is that each inspector can concentrate on the requirements, whereas team inspection advantage is that communication between the inspectors creates synergy effects during error detection. Errors found in this phase are documented. The third phase is error collection and consolidation. So all identified errors are collected, consolidated, and documented. Consolidation means when the errors are identified individually, they note down or make a list of all the errors that are identified by the different members of the auditors. The identified errors and correcting measures are documented in an error list. Let's check out the roles that are there in the meeting. So following roles must be staffed with suitable personnel. Number one is organizer. The organizer plans and supervises the inspection process. There's a moderator. The moderator leads the session and ensures inspection process is followed. It is advisable to select a neutral moderator to potentially balance out opposing opinions of authors and inspectors. Authors explain the requirement that he created to the inspectors, and they are responsible for correcting the errors identified, if any. Readers, they are the basically also called leaders. Read the requirements to the inspectors, should be a neutral stakeholder so that the inspectors can center their attention on the requirement instead of on the interpretation of the author. Inspectors, they find the errors and communicate findings with the project team. And lastly, there's a minute taker. He is actually responsible for writing down all the results of the inspection on a sheet and probably later forward it to the all the members that are in the meeting. So let's check out another picture that shows how these meetings are done. So we have specifications, we have a checklist, and we have a guidelines. So these people, they're sitting together, they are checking the reference material using the checklist and guidelines we will discuss later. So let's move on and talk about the third review technique, which is walkthrough. This is basically called a lightweight version of the inspection. It has less roles. That the roles that need stuffing are as following: the reviewer, which is inspector, author, minute taker, and a moderator. The goal is to identify quality flaws within requirements, shared understanding of the requirements, preparation of walkthrough, which is moderator or reader is in charge. Requirements are handed over to all participants and inspectors. Step-by-step validation is done. Author is the one who reads the requirements to the participants, provides additional information along the requirements. Minute taker document all the quality flaws identified during session. Basically, in walkthroughs, we don't have any checklist. Let's talk about the perspective-based reading. These phases are basically adopted with different prospects. We apply this technique in combination with the previous reviewing techniques. So they are helpful if we are used in combination. The reviewing technique and the prospective-based techniques are combined. Focus on the particular prospect which leads to improved results. Possible prospects are as following: user customer prospect, software architecture prospect, and tester prospect. This is for now today. Next week, inshallah, we'll talk about more about prospect-based readings, and see ya next week. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye.